Love it when that works. Hi everyone. I'm not getting an intro, I guess, so you just got me. I want to start off by asking, can everyone hear me in the back first of all, actually? That's not what I want to start off by asking. I want to start off by asking how many of you who are here today feel like you've ever made a mistake? Good show of hands, good. You feel like you've got something wrong, I would hope so, that's expected behaviour. Adversely, how many of you have ever feel like you've had that perfect moment, whether that be comedic timing, where you've had that perfect shot into a bin across the room, the perfect response to an argument, albeit 3 days after the argument happened? Everyone had that? Okay, at least once, good. However, the challenge here, I guess, is how often do we feel like we're always making mistakes, where we can't ever seem to break that cycle, that everything we do is falling down? Or similarly, how often do we feel like we're nailing it every time? Every single thing that we try and do falls into our laps and is a success. I'd like to think that doesn't happen to us all as often as we would either like or not like when it comes to either mistakes or getting things right. But why is it then, if that's the case, that so many of us really struggle with this constant pressure of having to get things right, or any mistakes that we make when we're at work? Is that really, should we be striving to get things right every time? Should we be aiming to try and be perfect? Or is that something that's really driving us a little bit crazy? So over the next sort of half an hour, 40 minutes or so-ish, I'm going to talk to you all about the term perfectionism, what that really means, how that impacts us in our day-to-day lives, how that impacts us in our work lives, and hopefully we'll go on a little bit of a journey together, pardon the phrase, and we'll dispel some myths about perfection and really what that means and whether or not we should be striving for perfect. And hopefully you'll all enjoy yourselves a little bit. It's a real sort of pleasure for me to be up here and delivering the final keynote of what has been, in my opinion, a great Project Lounge conference day. My name is Nathan Scott. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm the Agile lead here in the distribution Holiday Extras business. I'm not going to give you loads of my backstory because it's a little bit boring. But in short, something that I'm really passionate about is talking about and starting that conversation around mental health and how we can raise awareness about that. And perfectionism is something that can absolutely have an impact on that. So it's something that I want to talk about. Before we get any further into it, what with this being the final talk of the conference, apart from some raffle prizes and hopefully the people that win those will end on a high, I'm very conscious of the fact that if you walk away from this talk and haven't enjoyed it, it could put a real downer on the rest of your day, right? So for that purpose, I'm going to need you all to at least try and enjoy yourselves. And the first part of that is going to be that audience participation is mandatory. So, what with that being said, give us a big cheer if you've enjoyed yourselves today. Yay! Now remember the fact that you got free pizza at lunch, and then give me a big cheer if you enjoyed yourselves today. Yay! I don't know which one was better actually, but I'm just going to move on and get into it. So why am I doing this talk? Well, realistically, there's a few reasons that are impacting this today. First of all, is the fact that there's been an emphasis and a bit of a push for training more people around the business in mental health first aid. So we've had mental health first aiders, and recently I was lucky enough, along with a number of the people leads, to be trained as a mental health first aid champion. As I said, it's something that I feel quite strongly about, so I was really pleased to do it. As well as the people team-led initiative called Project Balance, which for those of you who don't know is a group that sort of started on Workplace and is an aim to really just concentrate and hone in on our well-being. Not just mental health, that's about everything, there's well-being, so we have yoga sessions that are happening as a result of the back of that. But also there's a lot of tips and tricks being shared in there on a daily basis, whether that's talking about confidence or it's talking about managing time effectively. There are loads and loads of really good things that are being shared on there. So if you're not part of that group yet, I would recommend going and joining it. But yeah, here we are, and we find ourselves in a time where more than ever we seem to be feeling under pressure, and we seem to be bombarding ourselves with this recurring question of what happens if I don't get this right though? It's got to be perfect, I've got to get it right first time. And actually I can relate. Over the last few weeks I've had a bit of an internal dilemma about this as well. I've spent the last few weeks really struggling, of maybe feeling borderline a little bit overwhelmed with things. And putting that pressure on myself that because I've got so many things that I need to do and a limited time frame to do them in, I've got to get it right first time because I don't have the time to go back and fix it. And And so it made me start questioning really sort of what is perfect, and am I going to ever really be able to achieve that? So I want to start off with this. Does anyone recognise this, by the way? Not one hand. Interesting. There is a couple. So this is called a whisk wiper, and by design it is borderline perfect. So the idea behind the whisk wiper, as per the people who created it, is that as opposed to hitting your whisk on the side of a bowl and getting rid of only approximately 80% of the remnants of it, the whisk wiper will help you have a perfectly clean whisk every time. Yeah, and it works, right? Apart from the fact that there's no real need for it to exist in the first place, because what's wrong with just hitting the whisk on the side of the bowl? I don't think anyone has any real difficulty with that. In addition to the fact that if you forget to put the whisk wiper on before you use the whisk, all you're going to do is just push all of the dirty stuff from the whisk up the handle, and you're facing yourself a real disaster. Not to mention the fact that how you're going to clean the whisk wiper is probably the same way you would have cleaned the whisk if you didn't have the... Anyway, the point is, by design it's probably perfect, but it's solving a problem that doesn't really exist. And I wonder how often anyone can relate to that we've come up with the perfect design, the perfect process, the perfect way of framing a conversation or a piece of feedback, when actually there wasn't really the need for it and it didn't really exist in the first place. Elephant in the room, by the way, it's not a pint, it's water, it's just the bottle. Thought I would address that because it looks a little bit weird, especially if you're from a distance. So I want to confess at this point that I didn't come up with all of the ideas of this talk by myself. I was inspired largely by a guy I saw at a conference a couple of months ago called Rick Tracy, who is a neuropsychologist, did get that right, and has collected master's degrees in 2 different types of psychology, which by contrast to my mental health first aid champion training makes him slightly more qualified to talk about some of this stuff than I do. But he's then actually, how did I meet him at a conference, you might ask, as a neuropsychologist? Well, he changed heart and changed career path and went on to become an agile strategist and a pathfinder for testing. Yeah, interesting titles, right? So to deep dive into the idea of perfectionism, I wanted to start off by doing something that he taught me, which was a little bit of here, by the way, because mind reading and that sort of stuff work. So if nothing else, humour me for the next sort of few minutes. So first of all, simple yes no question. Can any of you tell what I am thinking right now? No? Nailed it. You're right. You can, because by nature of the fact that you can't. So now can anyone think of a letter of the alphabet for me? Shout them out, feel free.
A.
I'm being drawn to this side of the room. E. There it is. As if by design you could read my mind, and we had that connection in there. It's working. So now I want someone to think of we're going to raise the bar slightly, of a 4-legged mammal. Feel free, get involved. It's lonely up here. Oh, I heard a horse. There it is. Exactly what I thought you would say. A 4-legged mammal there in front of your very eyes. Now this one's going to be the hardest one of them all, so you're going to really need to channel it with me. I need someone to think of an item you can buy in a shop. There is one rule: it has to be safe for work. We are broadcasting this and it's being recorded before all your minds go there. So can anyone think of an item that you can buy from a shop? Shout some out to me. Trousers? Did I hear trousers in there? Well, there is the barcode to buy a pair of trousers, right? Hold the applause, it's fine. Okay, I didn't think you would actually hold the applause, but don't worry about it. So really, it's not really mind reading, right? It's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek way, and it's a bit of a mick take of what mind reading really is. But were all of those answers perfection? Well, I mean, by definition of the fact that all of the things I put up on the slides fitted the mould of the questions I asked and fitted the answers that you gave me, so you could argue that they were perfect. Apart from the fact that they were completely useless and didn't really answer the question. So could you define those things as quality instead? Well, if we accepted those answers as quality, does it change anything? Does it mean that they were any better because we were thinking of them as good quality answers as opposed to being perfect by definition? And is that really brings us on to perfectionism, and it's why I think that maybe some of us might actually be a little bit crazy. In the run-up to doing this talk, I obviously did some research because I was well prepared, and the deadline to get these slides in was blinking ages ago, so I had to be prepared. So I did some research and looking into different conferences around the industry. And I fell upon a few of these that I wanted to share with you as to what I would call perfectionism talks. The first one being building perfect test cases. that baffled me. I don't know how you can come up with a perfect test case that would solve a customer problem and also work for testing a microservice behind the scenes. I find it hard to believe. Top tips to perfect your security systems. If anyone had already perfected a security system, why are we still making security systems? Because we just use that one, right? Because it's perfect by definition. But by far and away my favourite one was best practice for scaling agile. The reason that's my favourite is because best practice is just an umbrella term for perfect. They just didn't want to use the term perfect, which by definition means it can't really be that perfect. But talks like this in the industry exist, and they create this notion that we should be striving for perfection. And whether that's shipping perfect code, whether that's creating a perfect test plan, whether that's having the perfect team approach or the perfect team dynamic. But what even is perfect, and why is it something that we strive for? And what is it about that that's really driving us forward? Well, what perfectionism is it's not about being good, it's not about being great or very good and excellent, as this scale will have you. It's about going way and above and beyond that. And it's actually been defined as a state of being where you strive to have what you do matching an unreasonably high level of quality based on criteria that you or someone else deems to be perfect. So let's break that down a little bit. First of all, unreasonably high level of quality. Well, if it's unreasonable, I don't know why we should be aiming for it. And then the other part of that I really like is it's based on criteria that you or someone else can decide. So you've got to match their version of perfect as well as your own, which I always find a bit of a challenge. Perfectionism is really just an obsession with doing things in the right way and getting things right. And actually, I have the belief that it takes a certain degree of arrogance to try and assume you know what perfect means. And as a result, perfectionists often disagree with each other because they're so set on what their term of perfection is that if it differs to someone else's, that they're gonna live by the sword and die by the sword and fall on that. But really, it doesn't even have one right way. So most will admit that perfection is near on impossible to achieve and to find, so it must therefore be defined by everything in the world that isn't perfect or is invaluable. So therefore it becomes an obsession with everything in the world that is imperfect, which is literally everything by definition. In order to go a layer deeper into this, it's important to recognise some of the signs, the warning signs really of perfectionism, and the impact that it can have on you as an individual and the people around you and in your day-to-day life. Now, it's important to note that actually there is no real clinical diagnosis for perfectionism as an actual disorder or anything like that, or a mental illness, but it does form part of a diagnosis as part of obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD as it's more commonly known. And I know that the majority of you, if you're anything like me when I'm watching a talk, would have been reading those things up on the slide as opposed to listening to what I was saying there. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about what these are and why they may seem a bit vague. The first thing there is about all or nothing thinking, which is really the sense that good isn't good enough, like ever, really. And what that means is that it's really difficult to celebrate successes because you're constantly stressing over the fact that what you thought should have been perfect wasn't, and therefore it wasn't good enough, and you beat yourself out about that, and then that's where the spiral begins. So if you can't celebrate your successes because it wasn't perfect, that means by proxy it has to have been a failure, right? In relation to that, what people then do is they go on to set themselves such unrealistic high standards, meaning that they're not really ever likely to be achieved. Following on, what perfectionists tend to do is they develop this incredible knack for having a limiting critical eye, which essentially means they are able to spot all of the downsides and all of the flaws in everything superbly, but then they struggle to find any positives in certain situations, which is a real shame. The next few tie in quite closely, which is that obviously if you're setting yourself these unrealistic standards that can't be hit, that you then get depressed because you're never able to meet your goals, which then leads you to a fear of failure as to what the next goal is because you haven't been able to achieve any before, so what makes you likely to achieve one now? Which then causes you to be defensive because you feel the need to justify why you're doing what you're doing and why you're still continuing to set these goals. And all of those things just lead to generally lower self-esteem. If you're not able to ever progress the things in the way you want to, you're not able to achieve them, and therefore you're constantly putting this pressure on yourself that you're failing, it's no wonder that people start to feel bad about themselves. Then leading finally onto procrastination, which is that I haven't had the perfect idea to how to solve that yet, so I'm going to wait until tomorrow because I'll probably think of it later. And then tomorrow comes and you still haven't quite had that idea, so I'm going to wait because over the weekend I'll have the perfect thought to solve it next week. And so the cycle continues because perfection is unrealistic, right? It's ironic that all of these things are warning signs of perfectionism, given that actually they're all the results of perfectionism as well. Challenge to anyone? Is anyone starting to recognise any of this stuff in yourself, some of the signs and things that we're talking about here? It's good, right? Favourite slide. In all seriousness, I want to reiterate here that there's no real direct diagnosis of perfectionism. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a real issue and it should be taken seriously. And perfectionism is a part of that. So, we really should be looking out for it. But calling everybody who does have it or displays some of these signs just crazy or insane is not really the right way to approach it, especially not if it is part of a genuine diagnosis. And certainly not something I should be doing as a mental health first aid champion. So studies have been conducted though for years to look for links between perfectionism and psychopathology. Psychopathology is the official technical term for insanity, which includes clinical diagnosis of depression and anxiety, OCD, eating disorders, and the list goes on. And then what they do is they take those things and they look at the outcomes, so whether that be potential self-harm or general distress, and again, the list goes on. And their conclusion was, and I quote, and I'll read this to make sure I get it right, you'll understand why in a second, findings support the notion that perfectionism as a transdiagnostic factor by demonstrating that both dimensions are associated with various forms of psychopathology. Clear as mud, right? In short, there's a very strong correlation there and we should probably be doing something about it to call it out as a separate diagnosis as opposed to just lumping it in as part of OCD and hoping that people will just accept it. It's not always a bad thing though, right? Like perfectionism, it's okay if you're a bit of a perfectionist, it's fine. And not everyone who would call themselves a perfectionist would be struggling with mental ill health. So it's not having an impact on everyone, so it can't always be a bad thing. During job interviews, when being asked the question, what's your biggest weakness? Anyone want to had a guess at what the most common answer was? Spoiler alert, the talk's about it. I'm a bit of a perfectionist is the number one answer. Ironic in two ways. Anyone who's a true perfectionist wouldn't describe themselves as a bit of one. They're failing straight away. The other thing is that if someone's really a true perfectionist, would they describe their perfectionism as a weakness? I would challenge that myself. But why is it? Why is it that people feel the need to talk about perfectionism as a weakness? In short, it's what they think employers want to hear. Because it's not really a weakness, it's a strength, and I'm just going to cover it up as a weakness, and then therefore people are just going to, go, wow, this guy, he's going to work really hard. And it's true that actually perfectionism, if we were to give that answer in job interviews, it is linked with higher motivation. It's also linked to, in fact, a higher starting salary in some cases. But it's also strongly linked to overworking. It's linked to burnout, it's linked to stress, and the list goes on. So is it really worth it? Well, I mean, you could argue that as long as you balance the good parts of perfectionism and the bad, and you know what they are, and you can keep a lid on it, that it's okay to be a perfectionist. Wrong. Perfectionism hurts people every single time. There's actually studies that have shown that perfectionists over time achieve less and stress a lot more than just your regular high achievers. I mean, I don't know what a regular high achiever is, but perfectionists achieve less than them anyway. And it also shows that they're much more sensitive to diagnosis of things such as depression and mental ill health. There's even some studies that show that people who are obsessed with perfectionism tend to live shorter lifespans. So historically, there have been studies that have been done between pessimists and optimists, and ironically, pessimists do tend to live shorter, which meant they were right all along. And then they turned that study into perfectionism and showed that the correlation is still the same, because perfectionists spend so much of their time worrying and stressing about how they're going to achieve things or what they're going to do next, that actually they end up just burning out their life ultimately, which is quite sad. There's a few people laughing that I presume know what this is. So sometimes you do get an unacceptable state of imperfect, which is what I want to talk about now, and that's essentially, it's so blindingly obvious that something is imperfect and it's just not okay, and this is one of them. So for anyone who doesn't know this company, this is called the Useless Duck Company. and they are fantastic at not building things like this, but building things that are designed to do exactly what they are intended to do, but in a terrible way, and in a way that anyone would look at and go, why does that exist? So another one of these that is my favourite is the how to open a champagne bottle. I would recommend you watch it. And for the benefit of everyone who can't see the clip, if you like, behind this, those two hands are on a rotational device that spins at high speed to burp a child, which it does so successfully until it projectile vomits. So it's probably not really what it's there to do. And I would like to think that all of our dev teams in the room, all of our testers and engineers would catch something as catastrophic as this before we pushed it out into production. But the point here is that it's so obvious that it's wrong, anyone can see it, and anyone can point out the fact that, quite frankly, this is not expected behaviour and it is not what we should be aiming to be doing. So then you move on to what we call an acceptable state of imperfect. Now, for any scientists in the room or ex-scientists, will probably recognise this. Hold your horses, you'll get your moment in a second. And really, it's an unconscious acceptable state of imperfect. So what that means is that it's a point of which everyone's generally happy with because we know it can be improved on, but it's the point that that will do is the best way of describing it. It's like, yeah, we'll take that because we know we can build on it and then everything will be fine. So now, open to the floor. Anyone know what this is?
Molecule.
Close? Hang on. So this is the chemical formula for penicillin. Now, I'm sure many of you will know the story of penicillin and how it came to be, but for those of you that don't, a quick whistle-stop tour of that is it was designed by Dr. Alexander Fleming purely by accident. What he was trying to do was recreate a skin condition in a controlled environment, which I'm sure he was very capable of doing. But he then went away on holiday, came back 2 weeks later, and his skin experiment had gone wrong, and it started to grow mould, and thus penicillin was born. Now, this is a great example because he could have looked at that and gone, well, that's wrong, because mould's grown, so I need to throw that away and I need to start again. And had he have done that, what do you think the impact would have been to society today? He's inevitably gone on to solve many more diseases and help many more people through this imperfect outcome than he ever would have done by having it perfect. You could argue that it was a complete failure of an experiment, but a huge success for humanity. Now, Post-it notes is probably my favourite of these acceptable states of imperfect, and that's because this came about by someone trying to create the new best adhesive in the world. What he actually created was a pretty terrible one that wouldn't stick things together, it wouldn't even stick to itself very well, it was barely strong enough to hold small bits of paper up on a wall. Now, in a classic office environment, they did what I hoped we would do if someone was doing this, which was absolutely ridicule him. And they used the adhesive to stick bits of paper on that person's desk and essentially torment them. Until someone thought, why don't we use that to write actually useful notes to each other? And thus the Post-it note was born. And now it's very rare that you'll find a stationery cupboard that doesn't have Post-it notes in them, unless they're very technologically advanced and everything's gone paperless. But really, obsessing with things being perfect isn't always linked to things being valuable. And the key there is that there are plenty of alternatives to perfection. And I think it's up to us to avoid going down that road and really helping guide each other with how to cope with certain imperfections. Because the more you explore the same thing, the more you get the feeling you already know what you're looking at and that you've already seen this before. And I'm sure someone touched on it in a talk earlier, but sort of how many of you have ever been working on a new feature, been working on a website so much that the glaringly obvious mistake has slipped under the radar because you've gone, yeah, I weren't looking for that, I was looking for this thing over here. And it's really, really easy to do. We're not limited to having to find new things though, and here, I mean, I'm sorry, basically, because if you're like me, this is going to annoy you to no end, just like it does me. And the world is broken, really, and I mean seriously, the world is pretty broken. Things just don't make sense, and if this isn't the best example, I don't know what is. It just doesn't make sense why they would make all of these things in a factory, but just decide to store one the other way out to all of the others. I don't know. And I'm sure that if you look around this building right now, you will find things that are imperfect. Probably shouldn't have pointed out imperfections with the reef. Sorry, Liz, touchy subject. It's almost done, we're nearly there. But essentially, I'm sorry if you can no longer walk past the saucers in the supermarket and not notice things like this anymore because I've ruined it for you. And I guess that's the point with imperfection, is that everything's fine until someone tells you it's not. And then you start to realise, actually, no, you're right, it's not. And now that annoys me, when you were fine with it like 2 minutes before you knew that it was broken. And actually, it's the moment that something's pointed out as a flaw that is when people really start to obsess over it and start to panic about it and start to want to get it fixed. And that's really tough, especially when you're in a team like ours, where there are some jobs that are centred around finding imperfections, such as finding a bug on something to avoid it going into production, or heavily linked to it, where you're providing feedback and wanting to make improvements to things. And there's a reason why people often sigh when they're met with stuff like that, like, oh, by the way, there's this thing, and it's like, another thing. And there's a reason why that is, and that's because people don't want to admit that the world is imperfect. They wanted everything to just run smoothly, be delivered and work first time round. And ironically, it drives us to try and become even more perfectionists. But I take you back to my first point on this slide, which is that we all know the world is broken. You've only got to look at how many politicians it takes to mess up Brexit to realise it's fundamentally broken. And this can simply just be down to how we position things. It could make sense to us, but often lands in a way that says to someone, hey, you know that thing that you've been working on that's been going really, really well? Yeah, well, let me tell you all the reasons why it's broken. Or, you know that TV show that you're really enjoying? Yeah, well, let me tell you why dragons don't exist and therefore you're stupid for liking Game of Thrones. It lands with people in the wrong way, right? And it's for that reason that realistically, no one really does this to annoy people, most of the time. There's always sometimes, right? But most of the time we never do things to annoy people or upset people. We do this just because we find it interesting and because we want to challenge the status quo and we want to improve the way that things are. That doesn't make my wife any happier when I walk in and point out the one thing she missed when she spent all day cleaning those. So, word of warning on that one. So what am I getting at here? I think realistically, I would love to believe that we've all got a responsibility. And I do inherently believe that we have a responsibility here, that we've got a duty to be ambassadors to the broken world that we live in. And I like the idea of us being able to guide people through imperfection. I think first of all we need to look at ourselves and learn that we can accept imperfection and help guide you all through it. But then hopefully you can use that to help guide other people through it. Because there's always that moment of panic when people realise, that didn't go the way I wanted it to. And hopefully then you can take away from this that you can help someone through that and tell them that it's okay. And not only is it okay for things to be imperfect, but it's okay for them to point out things that are imperfect too. And then thus the cycle continues. And we've all been there, right? You've all done this most of your, nearly every day, a lot of you in your roles and what you do. And the vast majority of you have stayed sane. I work closely with some of you and I'd question it a little bit, but the vast majority of you have. Don't veer off into the trap of perfectionism again. Yes, it can be an uphill battle and it can sometimes feel like you're trying to turn around an oil tanker on your own. Changing deeply ingrained mentalities is not the easiest thing in the world. But when you get to that end point, it's really worth it to see that something is better than it was when you started with it. And if you can get people on board with you to rediscover the same things, but just in a different way and looking at things with a fresh pair of eyes, people start to understand that it is okay and they start to change their perception of what perfect should look like and that maybe imperfect is okay after all. Maybe then people become a bit more calm when things go wrong because they're more accepting of those imperfections and they start to focus on how to improve things as opposed to spiralling over why it didn't work in the way that it should have done the first time around. So now we come to the diagnosis part. We've been through a bit of a journey around perfection and what that is and perfectionism as a term and how that impacts us and all of the intricacies of that and how that plays a part on our day-to-day lives. And hopefully we've dispelled some myths that and come to realise the true value of imperfection. That arguably it can be better than perfection at times. But the challenge for me when coming up with this talk was I needed to be able to demonstrate that I can deal with an imperfect situation and show you that that's okay. I'd be a hypocrite if I couldn't stand here and do at least that. Now some of you will know that I am a big football fan and had the pleasure of going over to Madrid a couple of weeks ago for the Champions League final. Those of you that do know me will know that I'm a Tottenham fan, and anyone who knows football will know that we lost that game, so it was very much an imperfect trip. Now what some others of you will know was that how I got to Madrid was via a coach that took me 26 hours to get there. So in answer to the question, are we crazy? In my case, yes, is the short answer. 26 hours to get there and then we lost the game. Very much an imperfect trip. Sorry? I watched the game in a bar, which is the other thing. So I travelled for 26 hours to get to Madrid, thanks Liz, to watch the game in a bar with other Tottenham fans, and we lost the game. Fantastic, well worth the money and journey. What's better than that was that 2 days later I faced a 26-hour coach trip home again. 1 hour into said coach trip, the coach broke down for 2 hours. It's all true. There'll be people that can verify this. Liz was one of the ones who was trying her best to not send me crying emojis when I was stuck on said coach. Because they had to send another coach to come and get us. Now, why it took 2 hours for a coach to get to where we are, given that we'd only left an hour before that, still baffles me. But the point was, I don't think anyone in here is going to disagree that was very much an imperfect trip and didn't go according to plan. No, I thought so. It would be perfect in the eyes of any Arsenal fans that want to abuse me, but it was an imperfect trip for me, right? However, actually what happened was I got to discover a beautiful city in Madrid. On that Sunday, I could have moped around and just beaten myself up about the fact that we lost to a Liverpool side that didn't even play their best. But I got to bask in the glory of Madrid. I got to experience a fantastic stadium in the Santiago Bernabéu, which I did manage to get a ticket to go inside, and I got to see trophies for the first time. That was nice. I also got to experience the beauty of one of their national parks in mid 30 degrees weather, and the atmosphere around the city was wonderful. And I think the point that I want to hit home there is that you will miss all of life's sort of beauty and all of the wonderful things that happen in life if you focus too much on the things that are going wrong. I could have written that trip off 6 hours after I arrived in Madrid because we lost the game. But instead I refocused, I took reflection in terms of where I was and how lucky I was to still be there, and really embraced that. So I guess, would I do it again? Well, absolutely not, because I'm not insane. I do not want to sit on a coach for 26 hours. And anyone who knows me will know that I'm still suffering with a bad back 2 weeks later. Combined total of about 8 hours sleep over 3 days will do that to you. But do I regret going? No, I don't. And that's because I did have a fantastic time despite the result. And I'm able to look back and laugh on it now, and it's able to give me that perspective to really look at and to value the important things in life. So I guess my diagnosis of are we crazy is that no, not really, not most of the time anyway, until you decide to go on a coach to Madrid in the same time that you could fly to Australia. But I guess the thing is really don't obsess about it. Don't obsess about whether or not you're crazy. Don't obsess about perfections or imperfections for that matter, but just notice what is and just enjoy that and try and take the beauty of imperfections as we find them. There are 3 key learnings here that I would love you all to take away from this, and the first of those is that I'm pretty sure you'll all agree we've discovered that perfection is a myth. It doesn't really exist. The world is absolutely run on flaws, and it's what makes it a beautiful place. And if there is anywhere better than Britain at pointing out where things are broken, I would challenge people to tell me. The second one is that our job is not to be perfect, but knowing that understanding imperfection is really a worthy goal to have. And I would argue that actually it's even more of a worthy goal to be aiming for something that's imperfect as opposed to aiming for something that's perfect. By its own definition, perfection is unrealistic, so therefore you're infinitely more likely to achieve an imperfect goal. And the third of those is that our greatest value comes in the knowledge of our flaws. There's a lot to be said here, so I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet, which is that ultimately knowing that something is broken and accepting of that, whether that's the knowledge of our flaws as individuals, whether that's a knowledge of flaws in systems and in tech that exists, flaws in processes, being able to know that, recognise it, own it, and then want to do something about it makes such a big difference. And I think that's something that we should all really try and take away. And I would love to challenge you all to take these 3 things, to think about how they work in your life, whether that be personally, professionally, both. And once you've sort of worked on that, is to then try and help guide somebody else through this crazy world of imperfection. Are we crazy? Well, we don't have to be. Thanks for listening. Any questions? Yes.
Just very thought-provoking when you said perfection is a myth.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do think, like when we say the word perfection, a lot of the times we're relating to some kind of standard we pull from to be able to say we can do better, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the very statement saying perfection is a myth is a bit like an absolute knowledge claim, in a way, to say we've seen everything in the world and we know that there's nothing perfect, right? So, I suppose, what thoughts did you have behind that learning statement of perfection is a myth, and do you think that's something that we can be completely certain of? And if we can be 100% certain of that, then wouldn't that imply that perfection isn't a myth to begin with?
The second question was really good there. So the question, repeating that for remotes, is my statement of perfection is a myth. Could be flawed in itself, and how can I say that with any real certainty? I'm paraphrasing, so tell me if I've misread that. And then also, if it is true that perfection is a myth, then by virtue it's right. I don't think I'm going to be able to tackle that second one because my head's spinning about it a little bit. But in terms of why I put the statement on there in terms of perfection being a myth, is because for me, like by the definition of what perfection is, it's an unrealistic standard, which tells me that it's not something that's ever likely to be achieved. So for me, aiming to have something that is an absolute perfection is a myth, because that's my perfection and it won't be the same as someone else's perfection. So I could aim to deliver this talk in a way that I would go, this would be my standard, and to me this is a perfect talk. And I could achieve that, and I could go, well, that was perfect, and there'll be someone else who would go, it's not perfect because you didn't give out sweets. And for me, a perfect talk is when someone gives out sweets. And then therefore it's never going to be perfect, which is why I'd like to challenge the notion that perfection is a myth, and why, although I guess I'm not qualified with any PhDs to say definitively, everyone in this room, don't ever say perfection again because it's a myth fact. I would say that actually it's not something that I'm ever going to strive for. I'm always going to strive to be better. I'm always going to look for areas that I can improve. I'm always going to, it's essentially just my way of holding myself accountable, that I'm not going to rest on my laurels or accept things for the way that they are, because I'm never going to achieve that perfect standard. So I always want to raise the bar on that, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool, no worries. Yes, Pedro.
Isn't that true of good enough also? Isn't good enough a standard different for different people?
Yeah, absolutely. So Pedro's question there is that isn't that the same as it being good enough? Because good enough is also differing depending on who you ask. And you're right, it absolutely is. I think that a lot of people will be much more accepting of good enough. So even though we may have different standards of good enough, if I went that talk was good enough, and you went, well, it wouldn't be good enough for me, but it's probably good enough for him, so fair enough, is slightly different to me going, that was perfect, and then you going, well, it definitely wasn't perfect, and here's all the reasons why you're wrong. So for me, that's where the disconnect is, and that's where the difference is that people can be much more accepting of other people's good enough more than they can be of other people's perfection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like to think of myself as a recovering perfectionist.
So recovering perfectionist was the term that Pedro used for anyone remotely.
I think it's like alcoholism or any other addiction. It's something that you have to struggle with for the rest of your life.
There's also similarities drawn to alcoholism, which I may move away from slightly, but I do understand where you're coming from.
One of my bigger problems is deciding when it's good enough.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, probably my good enough is still more towards the perfect side of things than the average good enough.
Well, I think the other difference is good enough is easier to talk about to someone else, right? And you can say, this is, in order for this work, my acceptance criteria is that it's going to be X, and someone else will input into that and go, actually, I think you're maybe aiming for a bar that's a little bit too high there. Our acceptance criteria should be here, and that can open up a discussion. Where if you say we have to release the perfect thing, it leaves arguably less wiggle room, because the other person goes, oh, well, if they're doing it perfect, well, then I'll leave them to it because it's going to be perfect. And that's a massive challenge, because who can decide what perfect is, what's not.
I think you have a very good point there, which is to define clear goals and clear objectives. And when they're clear and well defined, it makes it much easier to agree on what is it.
Yeah. So for everyone remotely.
That's a big problem with perfectionists, is that they don't set clear goals for what they want to do, and then they always want to do something else more because it's not enough.
Definitely. for everyone remotely as well, similar to what Pedro said about Luke earlier, paraphrasing, I'm awesome. So, any other questions? Any on the call? Yeah, oh god. one observation.
It's bombers.
Yeah.
Those labels that he had with these sauces.
Yes.
Those one of them higher viscosity, which is why they're upside down, because it takes longer for the stuff to come out. One thing with relish.
Thanks everyone. What's happening here is Huz is giving me the science behind why the labels are actually the right way round, which is incredible because I would have had no idea. So thank you. And now I can deal with it. And now, even though I know that the world is still broken, that's an imperfection that I can now deal with. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one in the room who would have no idea that that's the case. So thanks, Huz. Cheers. Anyone else got any questions? Oh.
Yeah. I think profession's subjective anyway, so that answers what they're saying.
Cool. Anyone got any other questions or observations on the imperfections that I pointed out that might actually be perfectly imperfect in the first place? Cool. Well, thank you ever so much, everybody.